Welcome, everyone, to the Forensic Investigator Podcast, hosted by Dr. Jim. I bring to the table, as previously stated, decades of training, education, and experience to include authoring 3 books and lecturing around the country and in Europe and other places on homicide and cold case investigations. My full contact information will be provided at the end of this podcast. Today, we're going to talk about child abuse investigations. And to accomplish this, I have invited a colleague, Don Hayden, to enlighten us with his knowledge and expertise. So allow me to let Don into the room. And there we go.
Don is in the room.
Yes, thank you. Don, before I delve into your vast amount of experience, I want to obviously welcome you to the podcast. And I'm glad you have the time to sit and talk with us.
Absolutely.
So let's get to this now. Now, this is a shortened version, because if I sat here and had to read all of it, we'd be here forever. So let's just get to the key elements. Don retired from full-time law enforcement in June of 2023 after more than 41 years of service. He served 20 years in the U.S. Army, including 18 years with the Criminal Investigation Division, CID. While serving with the CID, his duties included overseeing sexual violence, child abuse, and death investigations at multiple installations. He served nearly 5 years as a branch chief and course developer at the U.S. Army Military Police School, specializing in forensic criminalistics and death investigations. He completed a 1-year fellowship in forensic medicine at the Armed Forces Medical Examiner's Office, focusing on death investigation and human identification. Don acted as a course manager and lead instructor for nearly 4 years for the U.S. Army's Child Abuse Prevention and Investigative Techniques course. Upon retiring from the U.S. Army, Don worked nearly 10 years at the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office as Chief of Detectives, where he supervised 7 detectives. Currently, he is a faculty member at Columbia College, Columbia, Missouri, teaching criminal justice and forensic science courses. He has authored 2 textbooks and was a contributing author to a sexual assault investigation text. He has experience in systems-based training development, records management, budgeting, planning, and personnel supervision, and this is notable here too, and was a recipient of multiple professional honors, including Special Agent of the Year, and in the state of Missouri, he got the Governor's Medal of Valor for Public Safety. Now that is quite something to be said. There is a lot more to this person, as I'm sure all of you will realize as this interview progresses. Don, again, welcome, and I thought the best place to start would be for you to talk about Ellie's story and how you got involved in child abuse investigations.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, and I'm happy to be here. Anything I can do to further the field of forensics is important, and it's been my life's passion. As you know, Jim, I took over at the MP school after you left a couple of years later, and ever since then, crimes against persons has been a real desire of mine. I started out getting involved in child abuse when I did my 1-year fellowship with the Armed Forces Medical Examiner, and then I went to the MP school where I taught death investigations. I was interested in child abuse, but it wasn't my sole focus until I came back to the MP school in 2008. It was in 2011 that I met Ellie, and Ellie was at the time I met her, she was 10 years old. And she'd been sexually abused when she was 7 by a family friend who was a firefighter, he was a paramedic, and he was a school bus driver. So he had all the things that gave him access to children. And Ellie had been on TV that she wanted to tell everybody about her story. She had talked to her counselor about it. She had talked to her parents about it, and they said, yes, you should do that. So KY3, which is a local NBC affiliate in Springfield, Missouri, gave her an award, a Red Cross award. I think it was called Everyday Hero. And she went out and spoke. This made me want to talk to her because at the time, teaching the child abuse course, I could talk about it forever, but to hear it from a 10-year-old was life changing. So I went down to see her, and I sat down with her and her mother. And 5 hours later, what I thought was a 1 hour precursor to her coming up and giving a 15-minute speech, I left. Absolutely, I don't even know what word to use. Just I was gobsmacked by this little girl. She was so articulate. She was so passionate, and she was, if you can follow this, she was so believable. It truly was. She described it as one morning, about 5 o'clock in the morning, she got up out of bed to go get a drink of water, and she said God sung into her heart and told her that she was supposed to do this. Um, and so I got permission. I brought her to the MP school, and again, I thought it was going to be a 15-minute, interview of a 10-year-old. Her and her mother talked to my class for 3 hours about everything you can name. And she is the reason that I wrote my child abuse investigations textbook. I always wanted to write a textbook, but I never had the right motivation. By the time I was in my 50s, I was just kind of cruising. And after I talked to her, I sat down with her and her mom, and I said, I'm going to write a college textbook about child abuse investigations, and I'd like to feature you. And they were completely on board. It's perhaps a little bit unusual to have a college textbook start with a prologue of a child, but I just felt that for one of the keys that I wanted in the text, I felt that was important so that people would understand the human element of what we do. And one last thing about that, I don't know how in depth you want me to go with Ellie, but the last thing I would tell you is that by every indication from a professional law enforcement standard, that case was an absolute win. Ellie's perpetrator was convicted both in state and federal court, went to prison for 15 years, and yet Ellie and her mother walked out of that case feeling like the system had completely let them down. They hired their own attorney. They went to another county and got a different victim advocate. And all of these things are things that professional investigators take for granted. And I felt we needed to explain those. And so in my textbook, I refer to Ellie and her mother several times in the chapters, as well as a rather lengthy prologue that explains it all. So that's kind of how the book came actually to be.
How did her situation become alerted to the police?
Well, that's another interesting aspect. Ellie's mother said that her and her friend, or Ellie and her friend, were playing, and the two parents were talking. And Alicia said, "I haven't had to talk about good touch, bad touch in a while, so let's have that." So she brought Ellie into the kitchen and she just sat down with her and she said, I just want to talk about your body is yours. And she said Ellie immediately started to cry. And Ellie said, this man touched me. And all she once publicly said was he touched me in ways he wasn't supposed to. And I've never violated that. I think it's important that we respect our victims when they want to publicly tell their story. The details of what happened to her, as awful as they aren't what matters. That wasn't the thrust of the story. And so after she told her mother, Alicia, they immediately drove to the police department and told them, hey, this happened. And that's where the problems, I guess, with the investigation began. That's why I called the book From Dispatch to Disposition, because when the police were initially notified or dispatched, they handed Ellie's mom, Alicia, a statement form through a bulletproof window, said, fill this out and a detective will be in touch. And that was the end of it. And so right there, they didn't know anything about this stuff. They thought they would go out and arrest him immediately, and it didn't happen. And the patrol officer behind the window was woefully unprepared for that. So he didn't know what to do. He never said word one to Ellie, and they went home. A couple days later, a detective called him, but then the cavalcade of different agencies, Child Protective Services, the prosecutor, the medical, the forensic interview, and they did not, this particular county did not have a strong MDT, which became a big part of something I always took for granted because working military cases, we have a pretty good system set up. But I realized on the outside they don't. And so that's why that is also addressed in the book, that working together as a team, because you would get Child Protective Services and the prosecutor's office, victim advocate, and the victim advocate from the local CAC all would visit the house each month. And they couldn't understand why that had to happen. The case was a year old when it was reported, and three people came to look and do the exact same thing. So it became a real comedy of errors for them, which only increased their disenchantment with the system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, is this a small department or fairly large?
Fairly, it's about 20 officers. So I mean, they
Okay,
have a
well,
detective, but that's small in the grand scheme of things.
yes, it is, and what I see is obviously lack of training, lack of experience, and when you don't know what to do with it, I guess they sort of run the other direction because they don't know what to do,
That's exactly true.
and that's a shame. I'm wondering now, and I'm throwing something in here that, and you tell me if I'm off base here. We came about years later, child abduction response teams. Do we have something similar to that for child abuse cases?
Nothing formal. What we have
Okay.
is, the FBI has their CART team, but
Yes.
that's not for, investigations. The U.S. Attorney always says it's not illegal federally to molest a child. And if you
Okay.
think about it, that makes sense because unless you're on a federal enclave, such as, a military base or some other exclusive federal jurisdiction, you can't charge them for molesting a child in the quote unquote state jurisdiction. So for that reason, the FBI doesn't get involved in that. Now there's ICAC, which does a lot with child sexual abuse material, what we used to refer to as child pornography. There's task forces for that all over, because that is a federal crime. And what makes that federal is it's always done by wire. You always transmit it. So whenever you put something on the internet, it goes over interstate lines somehow, and that makes it a federal crime. It's been oh, 40 years since I've seen paper CSAM material. And those would not necessarily always be federal because, unless they use the mail to transport them between each other, just trading that wouldn't rise to the level of federal crimes. So each state has differing task forces. In Missouri, we have the major crimes response teams that are usually set up because Missouri is a very rural state. So they're usually set up in 3 or 4 counties. You might, in a bigger city, have, like St. Louis has, I think, 3 police departments in St. Louis County. They have one for, that would cover more than just one department there. But there's nothing set in, you know, guidelines like from the International Association of Chiefs of Police or anything like that that says how that should be done. Those are kind of left to each agency to do.
Yeah, the joining of forces. Of course, now I live in Little Falls, Minnesota right now, and it's a very small community, but they have sort of a violent crimes team that if something occurs in one of the smaller jurisdictions, there are investigators from surrounding county agencies and others that will all come together to help that one agency work their cases. and not leaving the entire responsibility on one small agency. And a state representative is on that team too. So it's I just feel like that's a much better way to do it. I've always been a strong advocate of that when it comes to doing cold cases, pooling your resources of surrounding counties and putting everybody together as a team. And it's worked well in a lot of different jurisdictions. All right. There's a couple other areas I'm interested in, and it's more the medical legal sides, I guess, really. What about SIDS deaths for a little bit?
Okay.
Tell me what it is and what your experience is with that.
Well, SIDS actually ties into some of the research that I've been doing lately. The last word SIDS stands for sudden unexpected infant death syndrome. And in the legal community, we've tried to get away from the term syndrome because syndrome implies a medical diagnosis. In fact, SIDS is more of a diagnosis of exclusion.
Yes.
As we've gotten better with SIDS cases, in the late 90s, we had the Back to Sleep program where we were teaching parents to leave their child on their back, papoose their child, and get everything out of the crib because you never know when that kid's going to be able to roll over for the first time. Uh, and we found that with that, the number of unexplained deaths went down tremendously. And then we started to look, we being the community, not me, right? Started to look at other things such as co-sleeping, and by co-sleeping we mean in the same bed. Now there are a lot of co-sleeping arrangements where it's a crib that attaches to the side of the bed, and that's different because the child is in its own area. So when we got that, we found another layer of accidental asphyxiation, not a crime, but accidental asphyxiation. So now, if you look at the NIJ standards, what you'll see is that SIDS is a subcategory of SWEDE, sudden, unexpected, or unexplained infant death. So SIDS is a lot less now. I don't have the statistics in front of me. We have SIDS cases have consistently gone down because we're getting to the point where we're not afraid to say that this was an accidental overlay, not a crime, but not it's not appropriate to call it SIDS because we know what happened. And by way of example, if I may, I had a case here at Fort Leonard Wood. I can't tell you how many SIDS cases, but a lot. But I had a SIDS case here when I was with Army CID. Um, I was very good friends with Dr. Jay Dix, who was the medical examiner for Boone County. Jay passed away a few years ago, but I remember this one case in particular, and I took two interns from the office with me to that autopsy. And when I got there, Jay asked me, he says, "Okay, tell me the facts." And I said, "Jay, I'm not going to tell you any facts. I just want you to do the autopsy." And he said, "Well, that's not how we do it." I said, "I know, I know, but there's a teaching point here. These are two interns, and I want them to see what happens when they don't properly brief you." He said, "Okay." So we literally stood back, took pictures when appropriate, and didn't say a word. Just let him do his thing as if we weren't even there. Afterwards, he said, "Okay, it's a undetermined, probably SIDS." I said, "Well, that's no help at all." He said, "Well, you get what you give." I said, "Okay, I get it." I said, "Here, read this." And I handed him mom's suicide note. So the story goes like this. The MPs were on patrol and they found a van in the ditch. And there was a driver and a passenger. So the MPs walked up to both sides. Mom was sitting in the driver's seat crying. And on the other side, in the passenger seat, was a little boy of about 6 years old with a Walmart bag tied around his head. And he said, "So what are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to see my sister." "Oh, where's your sister?" "Well, she's in heaven." "When did she go to heaven?" Just a little bit ago, just before we left the house." So the MPs called. We made entry to the house, and sure enough, little sister was in her crib dead. And there was a note on the table from mom where she discussed postpartum depression and how she couldn't handle having a colicky baby and all the things. So she smothered the child with a pillow, wrote this suicide note, and was driving out to drown herself and her son in the river when she drove in the ditch and got stuck. And the EMPs happened along. So she went to prison, and the son went to live with his dad, who was an active duty colonel. So it can happen to anybody. And so that case is one that kind of emphasizes, that was going to be a SIDS case until proper investigation was done. And of course, we knew what we needed to do, so proper investigation was done. It was just I wanted to make the point, and Jay changed his opinion as soon as he read that note and saw the scene photographs and everything. Once I gave him a proper briefing, because I knew the anatomic findings of the autopsy were going to be the same. There really is none. SIDS is always diagnosed based on a totality of the circumstances, which includes excluding any other medical possibilities.
It's always been very difficult. You're absolutely right. And a couple of things you said there that I really liked. We've always been told that you sit and talk with your pathologist, you tell them everything beforehand and whatever. And I've always said, well, let's let him go on his own and see what he finds and then come back with the information like you did. And I've only done that once or twice, but I think that's excellent as long as they're willing to work with you and that not be totally, you're going to do it my way or else, that kind of thing.
And I don't know if you did your training in Baltimore. I don't remember. I think you did, but
Yes, more, yes.
we'd have never gotten away with that in Baltimore. I was there under Dr. Smilek, and you didn't. The bodies didn't get on the table if there wasn't a police report and photographs. So I'd have never gotten away with it then, but I wouldn't have tried either as a student, right? You
Yeah,
know, that's
I was there under Fisher, but I knew Smiley, John, Dr. Smiley. I really liked him too but anyway, let's move on from there a minute. The other thing about SIDS too that I just thought I'd throw out there that what has been some of my experiences is that there was a borderline between suffocation and actual SIDS sometimes. I mean, determining if there was a difference unless you actually found any evidence to it. Am I correct?
yeah. I mean, if you think about it, the mechanics of SIDS, we know that the majority of SIDS cases happen to kids that are preemies and that are like less than 6 months old. And the reason for that is because if you run their full gestation out, the extra 4 or 5 weeks, that's when their lungs develop. So we're already putting that child, at risk by bringing them out into the world. And if you just think about it, if your viewers want to just lay down on the floor right now and lay on their back and breathe, and then just roll over and breathe, it's a little bit more difficult. It's not impossible for an adult because we've got a rib cage and we've got strong muscles and all the things, even if we're out of shape. But with a child, when they do that, their ribs are not ossified, so they're when they're on their stomach, whole body weight comes forward, albeit not much, but it comes forward and compresses the lungs slightly. The head's turned to the side, so if they've got any kind of congestion at all, they're not able to breathe as well. And then add that, those teddy bears and everything else, and the carbon dioxide just builds up until they effectively suffocate. And we never see any of that. That's why we have to have a good scene investigation. We have to have, you know, in a perfect world, the parents wouldn't move the child, which is next to impossible. And I don't think, God forbid, that happened to my kids. I could have left them in the crib. I just don't think I could do that, even with my training. So it becomes so important that we do a good investigation. And there is an excellent, it's called a SUDRIF, Sudden Unexpected Infant Death Reporting Form, that's on the NIJ website. And it's about 30 pages long. And I'm not a fan of checklists for investigations, but I really like this one because when you get there, you hand it to the first patrolman who got to the scene and let him start filling out what he can, just put his initials by whatever he filled out, the lights on or off, odors, all the things. but it also allows you to ask the parents questions that you would be very uncomfortable asking without being able to use the piece of paper as a crutch. You know, I don't want to ask these things. I know that nothing bad happened here, but I need to ask these questions for this form that I have to submit. And it talks about what kind of formula and the lot number of the formula and what medications they're on and when they last ate and all the things that get overlooked so often when we're doing these cases. And it's not so much laziness as I call it embarrassment. It's that the officers that respond don't want to dig into this person's life at their darkest moment. And while I understand that, we're there to figure out what happened. We can't save this kid, but we can maybe save another one by getting this information. And just, oh, by the way, sometimes parents murder their children, and this gives us an opportunity to get into and find out if that really happened, because if it did, we need to do something about it.
No, absolutely. I as a chief deputy coroner, I had one that then no names or anything that I will mention, but it was a matter of getting the child out of there as soon as possible because the family was just really, really causing problems for the police at the scene, and it was really tragic. I mean, and they were just going through the process, and they were so we moved the child a little quicker than I probably normally would have. And once the child was out of the house, things began to settle down just a little bit. And then some of the interviews took place. Two interviews. I intend at a later point to, I have a young lady I met years ago that was a social worker, got involved with interviewing the children and started doing it for police agencies and so on. How do you feel about that from a social worker versus a police perspective?
Um, well, I mean, I was a police officer and did interviews. I've been a child interview since 2011, and I taught it for 10 years. I think police can do a good job. I think most do not. I've done over 1,000 interviews, which from a professional forensic interviewer is not a lot. If I was permanently assigned to a child advocacy center, let's say I did two a day, uh, that's, 10 a week, 100 a year. 5 years, I've got 2,000, 2,500 interviews if I did two a day for, the whole year. So 1,000 is probably not a lot from that perspective. But when I review cases now and I see these child interviews and I find out that these police officers are they're just breaking every rule. They're asking nothing but leading and suggestive questions. They go right to direct questions. Interviews last 10 minutes. They don't corroborate anything. I mean, it's just so I'm not a fan of that, except in rare cases where the detectives are actually good at what they do, and that's just not very common. From a social worker perspective, they're oftentimes a lot better at being soft and not as direct in the way they ask the questions, and if they're stick to their protocols, then they're pretty good at getting the information. Now, what the police do with that information, that is the one drawback to having a social worker do it. They do the interview, put it in a can, and forget about it. Uh, and the police have to dissect it and figure out, the investigative leads in it. So you're in Minnesota, so I'm sure that the social worker uses corner house, which I've got quite a bit of experience with. That's the first protocol that I was trained in, and then I switched over to NICHD, which is a more, I'm going to say more scripted, but I like it better because when you're a new interviewer, it forces you to stay on track. Corner house, you know the protocol and you're just left to talk. With NICHD, it breaks it down into steps where when you're trying to get the kiddo to disclose, you're not suggestive. And then it breaks it down into different steps of how to ask the questions and these kind of things. So I think it keeps more inexperienced interviewers on track. Excuse me. So um, I mean, it can work either way, but my experience generally has been that the social workers do a better interview overall.
Okay, yeah. I wasn't sure. The one I am particularly talking about, she's actually in Fayetteville, Fayetteville, Arkansas, is where she is actually.
She probably
Uh,
uses the same protocol then. They
okay,
mostly use fighting words down there.
okay. I'll when I talk to her again, I'll ask and see. But I was just curious about that because it's a very tough interview to do, extremely difficult,
Yeah,
and they can really be. Is absolutely right. All right, let me go on to another topic, one of which we discussed a little bit a few weeks ago, actually, and I just want to throw it out there to see what your take is. You said you don't like syndromes, or they don't like the word syndrome, but shaken baby issues. And I am specifically referring to a most recent article that appeared by an NBC writer. And then the title of it was Experts Who Once Backed Shaken Baby Science Now Fight to Free Imprisoned Caregivers.
I read
Now,
that article.
I know, I think I sent it to you, but you might have seen it anyway. What was your take on that article, first of all?
Well, the whole problem with Shaken Baby is that there's a lot of debate about it. First of all, let me say, based on the other side of my life in the 90s when I ran the Army Sex Crimes Task Force, ever since then I haven't trusted the media. So I know that article. So I know that article, and here I am on a podcast. But
Yeah.
you know, but I know that article only tells a tenth of the story, and so I don't know how I feel about the article because in some ways I'm doing the same thing now. Now that I spent over 40 years putting people in jail, now, I'm reviewing cases and finding missteps. And, we've had two or three cases that people have gotten out of prison on actual innocence. Um, I just had a young boy. I call him a young boy. I'm 63, so he's 21 now. He just got a very large eight-figure settlement from a state. It's not been publicized yet, but it's a fascinating story. We could fill a whole hour with it when it's been publicized with no problem. It's a case I worked on for 3 years, and it's you know so I think as we grow, our attitudes change towards things, which is why, it was in about 2000, late 2008 or 9, that the American Academy of Pediatrics renamed shaken baby syndrome to abusive head trauma. When Caffey wrote his Shaken Baby articles in the early 70s, Dr. John Caffey, immediately there was debate. Could it be Shaken Baby or does it have to be Shaken Impact?
Yeah.
And, he based his findings on having dual subdural hematomas with no point of impact on the outside. There was no dermal or epidermal injury, only, dural front, usually front and back, subdural hematomas. Then we began to realize in the early 2000s that there's a lot of people that don't think you could possibly shake a baby that hard. I can't remember the name of the company, but they came out with a baby that you could hold and shake, and if you shake it violently enough, uh, arms would go off in the head to indicate that you'd shaken it hard enough. And that actually worked against the term shaken baby because you had to shake that kid so hard that there was times I thought the head was going to come off, and people just had a hard time believing that any parent could ever do that. So they went away from it and went to abusive head trauma. For a while, it was called non-accidental head trauma, but they settled on abusive head trauma for that reason. And it's a far more, I don't want to use the word easy, but that's the only word I'm thinking of. It's a far more easy term to explain to a jury and to have them understand that head trauma doesn't necessarily have to involve violent shaking. You can throw a kid against the wall, have their head hit the wall just right, and do the exact same damage to the brain with only a minor impact point on the head itself. So I like the change. I like the change a lot. I think Kathy's work was critical. So to go back to your original statement, I don't know how I feel about the article.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and the media aspect of it too. I consider that as well. Uh, it just so happened, though, that one of those pathologists that was named there is somebody that I knew, and of course, I reached out to her and started talking to her, and she said, "Yeah, I'm starting to change my opinion. The science has changed, in my view, but there's still more to be done." But see, I remember in the '90s, probably early 2000s. What I also remember is there were at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, there were basically two schools of thought. One is you had to have an impact, the other you didn't. And
Right.
that was the argument. That was the argument that we were getting a lot of. Of course, I've stayed away from it for the most part. Uh, and but this was interesting, and it needs to play itself out some more. But it does bring up the question: did we by chance have bad science at that time? Maybe we did, maybe we didn't. I don't know.
Oh,
All right,
I think
let
we can say that across the board, though. Whether it's fingerprints or firearms or any of it, we've gotten so much better. I mean, you just think back to when fingerprints, when the Henry system came around. You know, I mean, before that, we were just measuring people, and Will and William West was. I know you've talked about that. That's the most famous case of all that led to fingerprints. So we had bad science then, and I would say some of the high uh, density uh, techniques that are being used right now are probably going to be found to be bad science in 10 years. I mean, that's just the way it is. How many people did we put in jail for ABO that are now getting out based on the Innocence Project because they're going back and doing DNA testing? So yeah, I mean, I'm sure we did have some bad science there. I don't know what it was. I'm not that sciencey, but um, I'm sure we did.
Oh, of course. And times do change, technology improves, and then that changes everything. All right, one other one, because I don't want to take up too much more of your time.
You're fine.
The next one that I have in mind is Munchausen syndrome, Munchausen by proxy. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Housing is very, very difficult. First of all, we don't call it that anymore either. It's still used uh, these kinds of circles because it's Munchausen syndrome by proxy came about in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. But we started to shift away from it. I actually had to look up when. It was in DSM-3. I couldn't remember which one, but it was in DSM-3 that we changed it to factitious.
Factitious
Hell,
disorder, and that's
that's the
DSM
one.
four or yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, but that's about
yeah, the
DSM three,
factitious
four, somewhere in
disorder.
there. Yeah,
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 because I had to look that up. Factitious
yeah.
disorder imposed on another. I wrote it down, but it too. It's very difficult to investigate because you've got parents that are so knowledgeable. They're from the police perspective, they're great witnesses. From the medical perspective, they're great witnesses. And I think one of the things that is important to understand is that you and I know that everybody's. And when I say that, people kind of coil back. They're afraid to be around me because I truly believe every person has evil in them. Um, we're just real good at most of society is real good at keeping it in, and we have good filters. And the more evil you are, the better your filters are. We see that in child abusers across the board. They manipulate child, they manipulate the parent, they manipulate the community so that nobody believes they could possibly be this horrible human being that would prey on children. And although Munchausen, and I'll continue to use that term, is not a sexual issue, it works the exact same way. The parents are abusing this child. They've convinced the child in some cases. We see them on TV where these kids are on TV acting like they're leukemia patients, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. And they bought into what the parents said because the parents have manipulated them, not at all unlike we see in child sex abuse cases. Um, and then as you go along, the parents ingratiate themselves with the nurses and the doctors, and they bring them cookies and they thank them so much, and and they know all the medical terms. So the proper investigation has to start with, covert surveillance, which is very, very difficult because just like child sex abuse, you don't abuse a kid in public. So they're not doing that to the kid in public. It's in private. But you can set up surveillance in the hospital when the child is hospitalized to see what mom does in the room. And sometimes we see mom will insert things in their drinks so that they'll pour sugar in the Kool-Aid or whatever. Or sometimes it's far worse than that. They'll put medications in food so that the child's blood work continues to come up bad and nobody can understand why. And they've had to research this. So digital evidence is how we prove those. We get into their internet searches and we get into social media posts and we look for their GoFundMe pages because it's always about the parents. It's never about the child, obviously. So we try and dig into the parents really, really hard. Um, and then little things you can see. I remember I had a case where we went out to interview mom, and mom had the kid literally tied in a booster seat at the table while I'm there to talk about the child, and she's feeding him one Cheerio at a time. And that really struck me as odd, but this was a visit where Child Protective Services had set up a home visit. So when we showed up, the home was spotless. There was tons of food in the house, all the thing. But when you looked at it, all the food was brand new, brand new. She had just bought it that morning. House was clean, kids strapped in his seat, the whole deal. So we left, and when we came back, I said, "We're going to go back tomorrow." She said, "Well, I need to let her know." I said, "No, if you let her know, I won't go." And she said, "Okay." So we went back the next day. House was absolutely destroyed. And the kid was literally tied in a chair in another room in front of a television. He was 4 feet from the TV, tied in front of a TV, watching TV while mom was off doing whatever she was doing in her own room. And so we ended up doing the case. We never tried to go the Munchausen route because this kid he was nonverbal and he was feral. When you let him off the chair, he was feral. Um, so we pulled all the kids. There was two other children. Went did the school records. Found out that a fifth grader was at a first grade level. The kindergartner couldn't do anything. And then the 3-year-old, who was the reason we were there in the beginning, was just his meds were all over. We took the kids, we put them in foster care. Within 4 or 5 months, they came back. They all, the two that were in school had to have IEPs, but they excelled, and it proved that mom was intentionally harming this children. It might not have fit into the Munchausen acronym or term because she wasn't really doing anything medical. She was doing all the other stuff. And that's why the factitious, I think, became a really good thing because these kids were going to be set up to have to be institutionalized for the rest of their lives. So the disorder that she was imposing on them was the nurture and the educational and all those things. And then she had pulled them out of school to be homeschooled, which just made it even worse. So that's the most recent case. I did that about 6 years ago now, where we didn't go after the disorder itself. It was easier to stick with the endangering the welfare of a child type of with this as an underlying theme, which is what I think happens most of the time. You probably have read about the case of Maya Kowalski. I looked it up last night. I had heard the name, but I didn't know it real well. It's the Johns Hopkins case. This girl had complex regional pain, and it went on and on and on. And the hospital reported it. And the bottom line, without going into a long sort of detail, the parents sued the hospital, and the hospital was found liable for $261 million. This was in Florida. And that was in 2023. The hospital was found liable for violating HIPAA, for reporting, their concerns to law enforcement. But in 2025, appeals turned it all over and gave the hospital immunity. And then in April of 2026, so just now, the case is pending before the Supreme Court, um, because the family says that immunity should protect a hospital from outrageous conduct, because they had took the child and made it um, a ward of the state, and the parents said that that was false imprisonment on the part of the hospital. So I think that's an interesting case that I read about. Obviously, I didn't have anything to do with it, but that I read about, because it shows you how, you know, medical facilities have to thread the needle, and it's very difficult for them sometimes to be able to know what to report and what not to report. And I think that goes back to all of it, where the parents, if they bully the doctors will back right off. And it's a rare doctor, especially in an ER, that's going to be willing to put their license on the line. So I think that's an important aspect of of this whole stuff.
Yeah, you're right. I'm quite familiar with CRPS, or chronic regional pain syndrome, only because of my wife has it. Uh,
Okay.
and the doctor, I think, in that case that brought that up was Dr. Hanna out of the Spine Institute in Tampa. I believe that's the same case. It may not be, but he was involved in one situation with a girl where the exact same thing was happening. So I'm assuming it's the same case, but I don't know. It's a tough one. You're right, absolutely. All right, wait, we've almost done enough here. A couple other things. You said 2 books.
In five, I wrote a very, very rudimentary workbook, um, for crime scene investigation and laboratory. I got so tired of people that were going to teach the crime scenes course calling me and asking me, "What do I do?" So I put together a little workbook through CRC Press, that spelled out about 10 or 12 quote lab experiments. How to lift a fingerprint and put it in a book, how to take pictures. All the things that we teach in a basic crime scenes course. So I did that because at the time I was just retired from the Army, from running the crime scenes branch and death investigations at the Army MP School. So I did that, and that was kind of the same way with my child abuse book. I'm not going to just write a textbook on something that I don't do all the time, right? I mean, could I write a textbook about interviews and interrogations? Yes, but that's not my passion, so I don't
Yes.
want to. And with Steve Chancellor, who has written so many books on sex abuse and death investigations, Steve's one of my longest friends. I don't want to compete with him. So we just kind of married the child abuse book right in there. He just published another one on equivocal deaths as well.
Yes.
And we're actually, not to make this shameless self promotion, but we're actually putting together a book that is on the prelim. It's going to concentrate just on the first 3 days of the death investigation, designed for patrolmen, investigators, and CSIs, for what you need to be concerned with in the first 3 days, because it sets the tone for the whole investigation. So I'm not sure what we're going to call it yet. It's literally at the storyboard level, but it's something in our lives with Second Look, that we're seeing that police don't know how to get started, and with any investigation, and particularly with death, child abuse, and sex crimes, which are the three things we concentrate on, that first approach makes all the difference. And I like to equate it to building a retaining wall. If the first couple courses are off, the wall will fail. If you don't lay the foundation correctly, that wall will come tumbling down once it gets weight on it. And that's what the investigations are. You have to start with the basics. We get so caught up in let's throw feral scans out there and let's do all these other things. Well, let's learn how to run a tape measure and a notepad at a crime scene. Let's learn how to make a picture, not just take your cell phone out and start shooting a picture. Let's learn why we need gloves, not just have them in our pocket. The very basics. We seem to have lost sight of that. All we want to do now is grab cell phones, look at digital media, and move on. Well, the problem with that is there's been many studies after the CSI effect first came out. The very first paper on the CSI effect, there's been lots of studies. Vanderbilt did one where this was in 2011, so it's not a new study, that they took potential jurors that weren't picked for juries so they could use them. You get a pool of 80 people and 12 are picked, so that leaves you about 70 to talk to, 68 if you want to be specific. And what that study found was that in over half the cases, juries expect DNA evidence in every sexual assault investigation. Well, if we're not even going to go to a crime scene and we're not even going to look at could this have happened logistically here, juries aren't going to believe it. And what we found is more and more cases were being lost because juries felt the cops were being lazy. And so I've always wanted to make sure that the cops weren't lazy. And that's why I concentrate on the basics. If you go out and you look, like my book, Child Abuse Investigations from Dispatch to Disposition, there's not many child abuse books out there that I don't know of any written by a police officer. And the ones that are out there concentrate on the psychology of it more than the mechanics of it. So I have both in my book because I think those mechanics are what matters for trying to get a good investigation off the ground from the beginning to the end, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. All right, Don, this has been great. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I wish you the best of luck. You're going on a cruise here pretty quick. Have fun. I'm going to close this out by saying thanks for everybody for being with us. Please join us for the next episode. And remember that if you have any questions about this podcast or any of the forensic services that might have been mentioned, please email me at jma.forensicinvestigator@gmail.com, or you can visit my website at www.jma4ensics.com. Thanks again. Have a great day and a week. Don, be safe. Enjoy. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jim.